Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Mavericks webinar titled The Time Is Now, Climate Crisis Burns Future of Generations to Come. My name is Onke Ngcuka, an urban and climate journalist, and today I have with me Professor Nick King as well as Gabriel Klaasen to discuss what the future of our generations will look like in light of the current climate crisis. Before we go any further, I'd like to thank our sponsor ABSA for sponsoring this event and making this discussion possible. I will also put a disclaimer to you all that this is my first time hosting and would like a bit of kindness and being excused for the small mishaps that may take place. So I'm going to start off with Professor Nick King, who we have here today, who has recently released a study on painting a grim picture, rather, I should say, of what the future will look like for the generations to come. And it's just when I read your report, Professor Nick King, I was just so flabbergasted and in disbelief in what the future generations will be facing. So I'd like to welcome you to this webinar and to our audience as well.
Hi, okay. Thank you. Thanks very much for the invite. And hello to everybody who's listening. So I guess really just is to say, look, the report is based on solid science. It's based on the AR6 report, which came out in August, but also all of the historical reports, and so on. The scientific basis of impacts is really unquestionable, as AR6 said. And so what we tried to do with that report was say, okay, but then what does that physical science tell us about what's going to happen to us people and to biodiversity? So we tried to interpret it. The AR6 Working Group 1 report had it in sort of generational chunks, if I can put it that way. So it was 2021 to 2040, 2040 to 2060, 2060, so sort of 20 years. And the climate, the temperature changes that will go with that and what that will result in terms of climate change. So we looked at 3 areas in South Africa. Well, we looked at the country, the region, Southern Africa, and then 3 areas in the country, Western Cape, Malanga, and then Popo, because while they'll all experience some of the same impacts, there will be some local context. And just briefly in the report, I mean, it covers basically that in Popo, it's going to get, well, everywhere's going to get much hotter and drier, let's put it that way, and very quickly. And in Limpopo, essentially, we're going to see much hotter, much drier, rain-fed agriculture will very soon not be possible. The water situation there is already contested between civil society, farming community, mining, and so on. So that contestation and conflict will increase. It'll get too warm to be working outdoors mostly. So even working in the fields and other labor is going to become extremely difficult. So
sorry, Professor King. Sorry. I see that our audience is saying that it is still a bit too soft for them. I don't know if it may maybe help if you can just take off your headset.
Plugging it from your machine.
Yeah.
Does that make any difference?
It is a bit louder.
Maybe the laptop microphone will pick it up better. How's that?
Yeah, that's definitely better.
Okay, we'll try it like this then. So the impact on rural communities will be the hardest hit. People won't be able to grow grain-fed crops. They'll have to work longer hours, but of course with the heat, that will make it extremely difficult. So you're going to see food security issues. You're going to see with extreme events, you're going to see crop damage, stock losses, and so on. And all of these will essentially result in migration as people can no longer achieve livelihoods. In Mpumalanga, similarly, but some slight differences. We know it's the most polluted area in the country, and in fact, in some estimates in the world, people are already suffering from respiratory problems, children in particular. Rising temperatures will exacerbate those. The same issues with storm events and lack of ability to grow crops and so on will become an issue. And of course, if we don't very rapidly see a just transition effected into those coal mining communities, and we're seeing very little progress on this at the moment, then the sort of social conflict and issues around that are going to be extremely challenging. And all of that is very disturbing, obviously, for the children, because they're in the midst of this conflict and have no ability to do anything about it themselves. The other issue on that eastern part of the country is the potential increase and for cyclones coming down that Mozambique coast, and those massive storm events that would accompany those, which could cause huge infrastructure damage across that high-felt region. That will impact, obviously, on the delivery even of those five power stations, and that infrastructure damage we need to take on board. And then, of course, in the Western Cape, again, the overall trends of heating and so on will happen. But of course, the Western Cape has a very long coastline. It's going to see serious storm surge and storm erosion damage. There's going to be the unique climate envelope of the Western Cape. The winter rainfall in the country is changing quite rapidly, and it's projected to move offshore, which means it'll gradually change to a summer rainfall region. That means two really important things. One is the whole wine farming industry will be hugely impacted, and we're seeing big changes there already, and we potentially could see the complete collapse of that sector. And the second is the Cape Floral Kingdom, the biodiversity, the fables, because that obviously has co-evolved with that climate envelope. Those two things, together with the coastal erosion of many of the holiday properties and so on, will significantly impact the tourist market in the Western Cape, which is a mainstay of the economy. And then, of course, you have already across the Cape Flats, you have overcrowding and informal settlements and so on. You're going to see coastal erosion, which will compromise spreading towards the coast. You're going to see groundwater intrusion with flooding and so on. So that already the poor service delivery, the lack of sanitation and health services is going to be exacerbated. And of course, the kids and the youth are the ones who are impacted the most on those. And then, of course, with people leaving the rural areas, not just in South Africa, of course, but across the whole subcontinent, because the whole SADC region is going to get very hot and very dry. There'll be massive in-migration. So those informal settlements already overcrowded and so on will have a lot of in-flowing migrants, as we've seen already, but increasing, which of course also leads to social conflict, xenophobia we've seen break out, the inability to deliver services. And of course, as temperatures go up and things like wind speeds and so that go up, the potential for fire risk increases dramatically. And we've already seen huge impacts in informal settlements from fires. And of course, those fires are going to happen more frequently and be even larger and more uncontrollable than we've seen. So, Onke, you said in the beginning, I think that I painted a rather grim picture, and it is a grim picture. And
very much so.
I don't want to be glib, but it's also a realistic picture, because what we're seeing is, as again, this is founded on really unquestionable science, and what we're not seeing is the urgent action required, not just from the South African government, but that's obviously most important to us. But I mean, obviously, all governments around the world have failed to act on the science to date. But in South Africa, we really need to be looking at these impacts that are going to happen and manifest themselves on the ground. So we're seeing a lot of work going into policy work, the ambitious NDC, which we've just recently submitted, and that's great and it's admirable. But under the Paris Agreement, the only obligation is to submit an NDC. It's not actually to implement your NDC. And unless we get significant climate finance, we're not going to see much implementation of that ambitious NDC. So as a country, we need to really start thinking, where are we going to finance these changes? Where are we going to finance the service delivery, the disaster risk reduction, the health services and everything else that are going to be happening in our communities? If we don't get that climate finance, we can't just throw our hands up and say, oh, we're not going to get what we expected, therefore we're not going to do anything. We absolutely can't just sit back and not do anything. The impacts are going to be too great. The current model that we have, the economic model, look at what it's resulted in. We have massive unemployment, we have massive poverty, we have youth unemployment of about 50%. And just trying to maintain that model is not going to achieve anything. So we need to really rethink this economic model. We need to shift onto a circular economy model. We need to shift onto one which takes into account climate change and biodiversity loss change, and really look at what we're going to do to offer future generations some sort of future that they can rely on. Because the other key issue, rather than these, in addition to these physical changes, is the mental trauma that youth are suffering. The anxiety around all of this information, the fact that they feel that they're being abandoned by the adults in society and those who are supposed to make decisions for the future, the lack of opportunity for education and employment, decent employment, and the fact that all of those, which are already very, very dire, are going to get worse if we don't mitigate climate change and adapt to these changes. So I think I'll leave it there for now, and we can pick up on some questions and allow Gabriel to speak on behalf of the youth, because that's one of our problems, I think, is the youth don't get the opportunity to speak for themselves.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Professor Nick King, for that extensive intro, and just giving us an idea of some of your findings from your research. I think also you've kind of delved into quite a lot of the points that I wanted to go into throughout the webinar, but that is something that we can definitely unpack as we go. I'm just going to hand over the mic to Gabriel. Gabriel is a intersectional youth climate activist based in Cape Town and has really been at the forefront of calling for climate action from our leaders in South Africa. And Gabriel, thank you so much for joining us today and giving the audience a bit of insight into why the voices of the youth are important in calling for climate change. And I'm just going to hand over to you to just give us an idea of why those voices are important in championing a better life for your future and those of your peers, and actually not landing up in this scenario that Professor King has clearly painted for us.
Thank you so much for having me, first of all. I hope my audio is loud enough for the crowd. I definitely think, first of all, it's an honor to be on a platform like this, to kind of have my voice heard. But at the same time, there are so many opportunities where young people aren't called upon, and oftentimes young people are tokenized and used. And so I was very happy to be a part of this because I know Onke well enough, and she's made sure that I've been worked through certain spaces, and it's never been a tokenistic relationship, which I've appreciated. And it's the only reason I'm here, is because oftentimes young people are used as these tokens, these rubber doorstops, these look, we've done this thing for you, good job. We saw it in the way that there was a youth consultation, quote unquote consultation, for the NDC, and government had muted the chat and was talking for most of the session. In the last 30 minutes, it took people saying, hey, things are muted, please open up so young people can engage with you. And that in itself is just a glimpse of why it's so important that young people are engaged actively. Not just because it's like, oh, we want to have our voice heard because we are the vision for the future. It's like, no, we are living the experience today. I was raised and grew up around Cape Town, but specifically and predominantly on the Cape Flats. I've got family, I've got friends who live in the Cape Flats. At one point, we were backyard dwellers with family as well. And a massive part of that comes alongside that comes shame in telling your story. But also, it's a lived experience that so many don't have, but so many have and aren't vocalizing because they aren't given the opportunity to vocalize. Young people's voices, especially in the climate movement, are essential, not only because for the first time in decades we're finally being heard across the world. And of course, that's in massive part to change makers such as Greta Thunberg, Vanessa Nakate, Ayaka Melitafa, and many others. Of course, I mentioned the big three, quote unquote, but there are so many around the world in my own community that are making moves and changes. Young people's voice is so crucial because we aren't going to only experience it tomorrow. We are living the effects today. We need for our future. we know what we want for our future, and it's essential that we are brought into the decision-making process from the beginning until the end. And even after the end, we push forward through the implementation stage of it all, because we can't just be asked, hey, what are your thoughts on this? We've decided to do it anyway. We're just checking with you just in case. And so I definitely think it's crucial that we are essentially kind of brought into the process from the beginning. For example, with the just transition, many people don't know how young people are going to be engaged in the just transition. We aren't even, we always hear about communities, but young people are part of community, but we are also a faction within community where we aren't heard because there is a cultural barrier. For example, in my community, I dare speak up too loud and be offensive to my elders. And that is a massive problem that we also need to look at. So yeah, that's in essence why I think young people's voices are so crucial. We love the experience today. We know what we need, what we want. We also understand what's at stake for those after us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for expressing, some of those challenges that you face in trying to get our leaders to actually take some climate action for a very grim future, but also a very grim present. And Professor King, this is something that you speak about in your study. You say that, there's going to be less water, there's going to be increased fire, food insecurity, extreme weather events. And when you speak about these, for me, it really seems like, you speak of these obviously in the sense that these are events that will take place in the future. But for me, it seems as though that this is something that we're dealing with today. What's your take on that in terms of if we're dealing with it today, what should be done to actually kind of not make situations any worse? And before you go on, I'm just going to ask you to project your voice a little so that our audience can hear you a little louder.
Great, Onke. Thanks for that. Yes, it definitely is something that's happening right now, as Gabriel was saying, and so that's why the report actually projects from 2021. It's saying, and then describes things that are already happening and how those will pan out. So, there's everything that needs to be done by government at the national level. Obviously, phasing out fossil fuels, investing in renewable energy. The big plus about renewables, of course, is that you can distribute them. It can be just decentralized. So that means basically every household can get solar panels on them. They don't have to wait for the transmission grid.
Sorry, Professor King, can I just ask you to project a little? You're sounding really faint.
Okay, I'm going to try and get a bit closer. Is it still?
Yeah, maybe if you just project your voice a little louder, it might be helpful.
Okay. So there's an estimate of about 5 times as many jobs in the renewable sector than there is in the fossil fuel sector once you've done the construction. We're looking at solving our unemployment problem in the country. There's one of the solutions right there. The other issues around that is that there seems to be no real communication going on the ground. And one of the proposed solutions elsewhere is that communities need to get community basically communication or counseling centers where this information is made readily available. That these are the impacts you're going to be feeling. This is what we can do about it. What do you want us to invest in? How do you want us to address these issues? Which again is a bit of the voice that's not there. Gabriel was talking about the youth voice, but there's also seriously a lack of community voice across almost every community in the country. How do we build sort of circular economies within communities so that there's local employment and circulation of the financials within economies rather than it's always dependent on big private investors, big corporations? We don't need to build massive solar farms out in the Northern Cape, for example. We could actually put solar panels on every surface, on every urban environment, every rooftop, every window and so on, the technology, so that you're generating energy actually right where it's needed. You don't have to build a massive construct a massive facility and then have transmission grid line. there are many things that we can do to address this, and what we're just not seeing it at the moment as being implemented practically. It's all sort of theoretical. It's all policy, and one of the reasons there is that we're not hearing the voices of communities, and for many communities, they're not being given access to the information they need in order to understand both the impacts and what the options available to them are.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Professor Nicking. And I think, Gabriel, a lot of the work that you do is very much centered around educating different communities about the climate crisis, trying to get them to actually care so that they can drive, important change and significant change, and also taking an intersectional approach to that. And I just wanted to know from you, Gabriel, you've been involved in organizing the global climate strikes, local side of things in Cape Town, and also being a part of Uproot, the DMRE, which is a series of events geared at seeking transformation from the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. And I just wanted to know from you, what is the youth calling for in terms of demanding change, and actually seeing a better future for themselves, and who that call, is directed to?
No, definitely. So first to the beginning of your question, and a bit what Professor was saying, the way that we work, first and foremost, I'm a community member before an activist. And I think that's something that is often not noticed. And I'm not saying anyone on the panel did that now, but it's just in general for everyone to remember, before you're an activist, you're someone who lives in the community. And so when the professor was speaking about having community centers be, the hubs of information, that comes up and brings up an entire new conversation about public spaces and the way that we engage, previously disadvantaged communities or marginalized communities, such as my own. There's very limited space for those type of engagements, whereas more affluent areas have those opportunities to just construct one in a week. So oftentimes we find our information through, in town meetings or hall meetings in schools or in religious institutions. I saw a comment earlier saying, what are the roles of, the religious communities and the interfaith communities? There are so many ways that community members get information where they trust the information. It is crucial that we remember that it's difficult if, for example, the professor were to come into my community, for my community to trust the professor. But whereas if I or someone who is a religious leader or a community leader who is established takes that information that they have co-designed and go and walk into the community and expresses that the reason that it's behind. And through my work with Project 90 by 2030, we've actually started doing that with community leaders. And so I think just that's my beginning section of that question is the importance of realizing that it shouldn't be it shouldn't be a community program that is instituted, but rather a community partnership. And that's the way that we kind of educate each other. And it should be a co-learning. It shouldn't be, I'm here to teach you the right way. It should be, how can you teach me and how can I teach you so that we can grow together? And then regarding the way that young people, or what change young people want to see, and the way that we want to go forward is, I of course can't talk for everyone in South Africa. While I'm marginalized, I'm not the most marginalized. If we're going to play these oppression Olympics, there is levels to it, and I acknowledge the privilege that I do have. I'm able to sit here on this webinar right now, whereas there are communities and young people who have never even been on a webinar because of that digital divide. We automatically thought, cool, let's jump online, Zoom calls, that's the way we're moving. But then we forget, first of all, do people have devices? Do people have network? Do people have data, And if they find like a 15 Rand, are they going to spend the 15 Rand on bread or on airtime? And that's an important question. So there's ways that young people need to engage in things. And I think, which pulls me to my point of what young people want, is we want a future that's defined by social, environmental, and economic justice. We know what we want but it is very difficult for us to say, cool, this is exactly how we wanted, what we wanted to be, because the system was never designed for us, and it wasn't designed for us to understand. And that's why when we talk about uprooting the system, and then I'll get to uprooting the DMRE in a minute, the crucial part is to remember that as we uproot the system, this weed, that we do not pull out the food next to it that is sustaining the society that we live. So do not pull up the things keeping our system and our people who are most affected alive right now. Do not destroy those structures, but rather pull out the weeds slowly so that we can ensure that people who don't have the needs and the means to survive, we keep them protected and secured. We need to do it with much haste, but it is very difficult, which is what young people want. We want a future that brings everyone together. When we talk about a just transition, we don't want equal, we want equitable. And when we talk about this transition, we understand that the renewables aren't the best and the most perfect thing ever. And it's like, cool, renewables are the only way forward. There are alternatives that we can look at. When we talk about green jobs, we don't just mean big industry. We don't just mean putting up solar panels. We talk about entrepreneurship. There's an entire angle and avenue that people don't acknowledge. But young people have these ideas, but we aren't heard. And so I definitely think young people want a future where they are co-designing that space. We want a system change where everyone is represented equally, or equitably rather. We want a future that is beneficial to us and that won't fall apart the second we decide, cool, this is how we're going to move forward. So I definitely think there are ways that young people can engage. Young people need to engage, but we also know what we do want. We really do. I promise people we do know what we want, but it's just a matter of, are we going to be heard and how are we going to be engaged? It's not about, cool, I'm upset that I wasn't engaged at the NDC. The problem is that we weren't called upon when the NDC was being drafted in the initial stages. That's the problem. It's been a thing of, the Paris Agreement mentions women maybe like once in the preamble and then moves on. And, youth a few times, climate, they don't even mention fossil fuels as much, or at all, if I'm not mistaken. And that's the problem, is that it was drafted by people who aren't affected, but rather people that are probably feeling a little bit of guilt at the way that they've left the world for generations to come and generations today. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you, Gabriel, for just expanding on that. And just to continue on that, if I may, the South African, there was a group of youth that came together recently to launch the South African Youth Climate Action Plan. And I think that was a very good way of having the youth, take things into their own hands and actually say, this is what we see, these are the foreseeable challenges that we could face, and this is how we would like the department and our leaders to actually deal with the problem. And the youth went out and set out this plan and said that these are the steps that need to be taken, and this is how we would like for it to be done, and this is how we would like for it to be involved. Can you maybe just expand a little on the South African Youth Climate Action Plan and why it is important, but also how the youth can actually encourage the leaders to actually use that climate action plan in overall policy related to climate action?
Definitely. So the South African Youth Climate Action Plan was a process, and it still is a process because the document is a living document. And so it was a process that was initiated by Youth at SAIA. And of course, they kind of held the space for it to be and facilitated the conversation. And it was a document that it was quite timely as to edit. I spent many a evening with a few friends and colleagues kind of editing that space, but the engagement process was so perfect that obviously there were hiccups. I'm not going to say it was amazing, it was extraordinary, but there was actual want. People went into schools, asked schools, young children as young as 7, what do you want to see? And we broke down what those questions are. Not saying, cool, what are your thoughts about the just transition? And then expect a 7-year-old to understand that, but rather break down the questions as simply as we can so that we can engage with people's and young people's viewpoints. As old as people as 35, because in South Africa, youth are 30, from young till 35. And so the process was quite time consuming, but the document in itself is also quite, I think, powerful. It's the first of its kind in South Africa. And the structures that are put forward, there's intersectionality, advocacy, and activism, intersectionality, I did say intersectionality, there's community. I forget all the points, but there are 5 main pillars to it that were quite, it was quite difficult to narrow down on those points because we wanted this document to be revolutionary and then, it's going to be radical. But then we realized who we're working with when it comes to government and decision makers. We can't say, you're not working, you're not doing this. We've got to say, cool, we acknowledge what you're doing here, but this is how we can try and streamline it a little bit better and what young people think could be implemented here. For example, there was an entire section on community. And, when we talk about initiatives, we always talk about initiatives being put into schools, but not everyone is in school. So there needs to be community initiatives for teenage youth. It's also about your wording. It shouldn't just be for, high school youth. No, it's for teenage youth. It should be for young people who can access the space. It shouldn't be a problem of, okay, cool, I'm going to school and then only in the school I'm going to get answers and move out. It should also be a situation of, cool, I'm in the community, I'm trying to help people understand. But when I'm in the community, I'm not going in there with English if the community doesn't speak English as a first language. It shouldn't be a situation where you have these documents and these engagements where people aren't allowed to really engage with one another in proper ways. It's participation and public participation, but not active public participation. And that's the problem. And I see someone's lovely put the pillars in intersectionality, advocacy and activism for climate action, good governance, systemic change, and environmental sustainability. The document, I'm sure someone will place it in the chat. I would genuinely say, look at it, read it. It's a way young people think we can begin the conversation of having our voices implemented. It's a beginning stage of how we can have change defined by young people. But at the same time, we don't know if government's actually going to pick it up. We can only hope that they do. And that structures surrounding it, for example, NGOs, the P4C, different structures also pick it up as they develop their frameworks. I know the Presidential Climate Change Committee are in the process of developing a just energy transition or just transition framework. And I would hope that they would look at that document and say, okay, cool, this is where we can begin engaging with young people. Because why is it that I always have to, or someone always has to come into a meeting and say, remember youth? It shouldn't be a situation of remember youth, remember women, remember Black and brown people, remember indigenous folks. It shouldn't be a situation. It should be first nature, but it isn't. And I think with the SAY-CAP and documents like it that will follow, we hope to have the way that we think, at least the way that we think, changed, so that policy, law, bylaws, and other things that frame the way that we work in South Africa are changed and actually inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. And just to go back to the study, Professor Nick King, you do mention, some of these, and I'm just reminded by Gabriel speaking on some of, how you have to adjust going into different communities in order to enlighten them and to encourage them to take climate action and to educate them as well. Your study mentions on particularly having access to less water. Mentions that, children will actually lose out on going to school because, particularly women and girls, because they will be spending most of their time trying to source water, standing in long lines for water, and so forth. But it can be argued that in some communities that this is a current reality. That women and girls are not being educated because they have to deal with water issues, and so I just wanted to know from your take, how can our leaders actually kind of bridge the gap in terms of how we will deal with the climate crisis and the future that you've painted, because most communities are actually dealing with the extremities that you mentioned, and those extremities being in the future, they're dealing with them right now. And so I just wanted to get your take on that and expand on your thoughts.
Yeah, Anke, I mean, they are dealing with them right now, and of course, with climate change and its impacts, all of those are going to be exacerbated. So sort of all of the socio-ecological and environmental issues we're wrestling with today are simply going to become worse. And that's why sort of trying to continue with the current economic model is just, it's a non-starter. I think if I can just take a sort of slightly bigger picture view on this, the last year has shown us that when we have the political will, transformative change across society is possible. And, the climate crisis, the environmental crisis, is a bigger crisis than the COVID crisis. We need to treat it as such. So it needs to be the country and all countries of the world, but let's stick with South Africa. We need to put ourselves almost onto a war footing where it's a whole of society change and to address these issues. And that means that we try and put all of our resources into things like solving community water and sanitation issues so that particularly girl children are not disadvantaged further and taken out of school and having to do things like go and stand in water queues and so on, so that we try and provide water and sanitation services locally in communities and prevent them. Because we know these things are coming. We know they're coming down the line. We know that we got a basic income grant during COVID. Well, that should continue, a universal basic income grant, because when Gabriel was saying, we can't impact people who are already really the most marginalized. How do we help those people through these transition phases? Well, a basic income grant is one of those small things that can be done. And it's proven to be very beneficial. Gabriel also mentioned about not access to data and internet. Well, why don't we make data free across the country, or at least 100 gigs of data per person free, so that people have access to the internet, they have access to information, they have access to education. We can't physically go and reach everybody, and why should we when we already have the technology available? I mean, South Africa has some of the most expensive data in the world. Well, government, intervene. Let's get free data so that everybody can have access. So there are all sorts of things that we can do to build resilience in the communities. And most of it comes around a lot of what Gabriel was saying, which is that interconnectivity within communities. Because resilience comes from having more and more connections, more and more access to partners, more and more access to information, so that people can get better information, on-time information, can discuss it with a broader group of stakeholders, and then understand what are the best options available to them. The green entrepreneurship Gabriel was talking about, absolutely. It's much more than just renewable energy. It's about restoration of our water catchments, for example. It's about cleaning up the pollution that's around. There are all sorts of entrepreneurial opportunities, as well as real, just, manual labor opportunities. And for people who don't have any employment, there are great opportunities in this sort of green economy to be brought into that economy and participate in it, rather than having to depend on, no, South Africa is going to become this massive manufacturing hub. Well, it's not, because we don't have water for that. We're a semi-arid country. So these sort of ideas that we're going to keep investing in 20th century thinking is crazy. The Messina-Mercado exclusive economic zone is a classic example. It's this massive industrial zone near Messina, when the Limpopo River is already oversubscribed. There is no water. And I think it was the MEC for Limpopo saying, but what we're going to do is we're going to trap all the flood water that's coming down the river. Well, you may not get flood water. And if you do, by definition, floods cause lots of infrastructural damage. So you're going to wash away the infrastructure. So, this mindset, we have to change our minds. And this is a very different world. The economic system that we currently have has resulted in changing the physical world that we're in. And that physical world is going to disrupt our lives dramatically unless we change this economic system, which is bringing about those changes. So everything needs to become much more localized. Everything needs to become much more decentralized. Everything needs to become a circular economy. Everything needs to become eco-centric, with people right at the center of that. And that's the only way that we're going to change this. We cannot have this sort of idea that an economy, a less developed country economy, is dependent on foreign direct investment. Investment, by definition, means you want more out than you put in. So how's that going to help us? I mean, I'm being fairly glib here, but these sort of macroeconomic policies that we seem to think are going to solve our problems, when those are what have got us into the problems, that's not going to solve anything. So building it from the bottom up, building it, as Gabriel was talking, from a community level, building it up about what do people want? How do youth see a future for themselves? What kind of future is that? We've never been there before, obviously, so we can't paint that picture. We can't be definitive about it. But what we do know is we want to move away from where we currently are, because that's not helping anyone.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, just to continue on that in terms of getting the youth involved, a lot of our leaders are taking their advice from academics, and you yourself are one. Are academics actually making space to include the youth in drawing up these recommendations to our leaders? And if not, how can they do so? And would it be helpful in terms of ensuring a better future for those generations to come?
Okay, look, I think there's certainly scope for a lot more work in that sphere. There's no doubt about it. But there are sort of academics who have been leading, for example, the fossil-free UCT campaign, which then went to fossil-free South Africa and so on. Gabriel mentioned the South African Youth Climate Action Plan came out of the SIRE, Southern African International Research youth program, and the SIRE is a research organization. So I think there is attempts from the research community on that. I'm only partially an academic, by the way. I do a lot of implementation on the ground, but there is scope for much more. And I think again, it's engaging all sectors of society. We have to, and we need to bring in business in a big way, and say to business, look, you're not working for society as a whole. You're basically working for the elite 10%, and we need to engage with business on a far more equal footing in order to make sure that business. The primary objective of business should not be just to make profit. The primary objective of business is to be a benefit to society. So that includes things like social welfare, employment, sure, but human rights, decent jobs, non-exploitation. It's a whole bunch of things over and above just being financially viable, which is essentially what profit is. And taking excessive profits is crazy. The inequity in South African society is part of the biggest in the world, and there's been a lot of work recently going around what CEOs make as opposed to most of the workers in their sector, and those gaps are obscene, and they're totally unnecessary. So we need to be looking at how do we make this society a far greater egalitarian society than it is, because it's only by coming together as a cohesive society that we'll build the resilience to actually survive what's coming down the track, I guess.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Professor Nick. Before we actually run out of time, I'd like to bring in our fellow audience who have been so well in. Sorry, Gabriel, do you have something to add?
Just one point on the point that Professor Nick mentioned earlier about the day zero coming forward again. In 2018, we saw day zero hit Cape Town in extreme ways, but I just want to extra highlight it because I work with people and young people who have been experiencing day zero since the day they were born. It's not a thing of the past or the future. People are still experiencing it. People have experienced it before it became well known in media. Before we had the countdown clock to the 13% in our, before we had that, people have been experiencing day zero. And now even I can go and turn the tap on, there are people who have to walk kilometers to turn the tap on. And, those people oftentimes are young girls, which trigger warning for anyone who is, sensitive to it. Gender-based violence, rape, sexual assault is a massive thing that we need to acknowledge happens. And we are in a femicide in South Africa. And so I think an important thing to acknowledge is that we don't need to change the way that we interact because it's the right thing to do, but because if we don't, we're going to continuously see what's happened continue and just get much worse. And I know it's weird for me to end my section before we move to the chat, but I just genuinely think if I didn't say it, it would be an injustice. There are people suffering before and after, and even before and after media picks it up, before and after communities pick it up, before and after governments come around and do their tour. we need to acknowledge that. And if we don't, we are in trouble. So that's all I had to add to that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for making that point, because I think it's such an important one, especially with the rate of gender-based violence in this country, and also taking into consideration how intensely we're going to be affected by the climate crisis. So I'm just going to skip over into our chat right now from our audience, and I'm going to start with a question from David Ngcuka, who says, "Good day to you all. David Ngcuka here in Pretoria, Hatfield. We have an idea of impacting climate crisis in this new normal. Would like assistance in building a circular economy around our town by building a recycling plastic factory building by this waste collectors around the streets. Please advise." Professor Nick King, I think this one might be a good one for you to answer.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's a great question because it speaks right to what I was saying about sort of localized circular economies. If we take it broadly in nature, there's no such thing as waste. And yet in human sort of society today, it's all about you take stuff, you make stuff, you throw it away, and then there's landfills, which are a problem themselves. It's this linear economy. So yeah, any attempts to create circular economies, localized economies, sharing economies, is a step in the right direction. All of those reduce waste, they reduce carbon emissions, they reduce the need for manufacturing. So anything that reduces sort of consumption and reutilizes and reuses anything that's being produced is a step in the right direction. There are a few cooperatives around which do support those. So I would, again, strongly encourage anybody who's attempting to do that, those entrepreneurial attempts.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor King. And we also have a question here from Jacques Bukes, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who says, "Greetings to all the panel members. Thank you for this very important discussion. What role could religious communities play in this very important discourse?" I think, Gabriel, you touched on that. I don't know if you'd like to expand your thoughts a little further.
Maybe just a very short addition to what I said. We are in a world where we can't assume that people aren't needed, and that the only people that are valuable to discourse are academics and people who come in with facts. Because at the end of the day, we all know that the way that communication happens is within the community through WhatsApp groups, through Facebook groups. Community is more likely to trust the person next to them who they know are going to sort them out and protect them, who are, for example, when the pandemic hit, we waited for government to act, but when they didn't, communities mobilized for themselves. And that's just one proof of how resilient communities are. When it comes to religious institutions or individuals or leaders, I think it's important that we acknowledge their purpose and their deep responsibility and their want to kind of be a part of the space. Obviously, many of you are maybe familiar with the organization SAFC and many other interfaith organizations. There are so many people who can get across the message of why it's important that we care about the climate, that can make it real, that can make climate change a tangible thing, and that's why when you mentioned earlier, Onke, our youth being engaged in the academic level, but I would also add our youth and all the community members being engaged at the academic level. And I would urge the academic level to look at it that way, because at the end of the day, when you've written a paper about this thick, who is going to disseminate that into your community? Who is going to break it down? It's all fun and games to copy and paste, the report summary into Google Translate and, and then print that. But that means absolutely nothing because there's no word for climate change in this Xhosa. How do you break it down? And it's so important that we realize that. And that's the same thing with religious leaders. There's a crucial role that they play. The community trusts them. The community believes in them. And oftentimes, they are who the community turns to at the first bout of problem. We saw it with the pandemic. And hopefully we'll start seeing it now as community resilience builds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel.
I think the
of
point Gabriel made, the most important point is the trust. So faith leaders have the trust of the communities that they work with. So for them to be the conveyors of the information is absolutely critical. So the communities do believe, do talking to them as opposed to some politician or even some academic.
Definitely. And speaking of politicians, we have a question here from Dennis Bailey, who asks, is Gwede Mantashe, the Minister of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, is Gwede irrelevant? I see Eskom buying batteries. I'm going to throw this question to Gabriel first, because he was very much involved in the Uproot DMRE protest. So Gabriel, if you can go ahead, and obviously Professor Nick King, you can add to that.
Thank you. So we started planning the mobilization, just painting a quick picture. We started planning the mobilization this time last year. And at that time, it wasn't an Uproot the DMRE action. And by the time it got to this year, we realized quite fast that if we want to just transition in this country, if we want any form of Green New Eskom, any form of campaign moving toward an energy source that is either socially owned or just renewable and alternative based, we need to go through and acknowledge that the DMRE is the biggest roadblock and barrier to the way we move forward. And at the helm of the DMRE is Minister Gwede Mantashe. And to not perjure myself, I won't much say anything to him, but I think we see the way that he believes that coal is king. We see the way that he believes that renewables are premature and not needed. But we need to pull down the curtain and show the wizard behind it. He doesn't have powers that he says he does. But in fact, he does technically, because he makes the decisions. The same way that the wizard made the decisions throughout that movie or the book. We need to acknowledge that we as people have the power to make the decisions. So to a degree, Gwede is not relevant to the story, but he is, because he plays this vital role as gatekeeper to change, to a degree. And so, of course, I do think that he is relevant. We see Eskom's want to begin kind of transitioning, but of course, not only Gwede, but the DMRE as a whole is playing the kind of gatekeeper, so to speak. So I definitely think he does play a role, but we need to realize that the power lies with us and we can bring forward change.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. Professor Nick King, I don't know if there's something you'd like to add on to that.
Yeah, look, I think Gabriel explained it pretty well. I mean, he's not irrelevant because he is the gatekeeper and he is preventing the change which we know is necessary and is demanded. In all fairness, somebody has said that, he's protecting the interests of the coal workers. And in one sense, maybe, but the other sense, of course, is that holding on to what is essentially a dying sector, a dead sector, 20th century, is not helping the coal workers whatsoever. So, our Ministry of Energy should be leading the change. They should not be the ones who are being dragged along behind. So it is quite a difficult one to understand. There's lots of politics to play there because it doesn't make any sense around it. And when we see things like, gas is the future, clean coal is the future, all of these things which have been shown scientifically, absolutely, those are irrelevant to our future, then you have to really wonder what's at play there. So it's a difficult time for the country. Transitions are always difficult, and it's very, very complex. But I think, again, Gabriel touched on the point. The point is the power lies with civil society. We all need to become activists. We all need to become more aware of the issues and to be out there demanding change, demanding the change that we understand is going to be beneficial to today's youth, communities today, but future generations. Because holding on to this past, the longer we delay, the more difficult and the more expensive it becomes. The sooner we leapfrog over these old technologies, and take on board everything that the new century is offering us, the easier it is. It's going to be hard, but it'll be easier the faster we do it. It'll be cheaper the faster we do it. So I would just encourage everybody on this to, whatever your communities, whatever groups you're in, whether they're faith communities or school groups or your business, is get on board this need for change, this need for transformative change. We need to change as fast as we possibly can, but we need to do it in an inclusive way that brings everybody along. What we don't need is change which leaves 80% of the population behind, as has happened for the last 100, 200 years.
Thank you so much to you both. I would love to get through all of the questions, but we are running a little bit out of time. So I'm going to ask each of you to just give us a few closing remarks to end off the webinar. And if I can start with you, Gabriel, you each at this rate have about 2 minutes to kind of wrap it up.
Excellent. First of all, thank you for everyone who came today. I think it's important we see the numbers in the space, to hear the voices of young people. Of course, I'm one of the many that need to be heard. And so I think as we look at climate change in young people and the impacts that we face today, we'll face tomorrow, and for the foreseeable future until we have change, there are 4 things I'd like to leave you with today. Is one, we need government to demand help from international governments. We need climate finance that is owed to us by the international government. We've been promised money. The money has not come through. But alongside that, we need government to take care of that money because there's no transparency as it stands. I'd hate to see $1 billion come in only for $1 billion to be wasted and robbed from us. So that's one part. 2, for young people, for women, and the reason I say young people, women, is because even though they are young women, I need to make sure that people understand the need to incorporate women, young people, women. For Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we need to be incorporated into conversations. It is crucial that we are incorporated, not only because we are currently in the frontline communities and wow, it would be inspiring to see blah, blah, blah. We need to be incorporated because we are facing the issues and we know what we want for our future. We know what's at stake if we don't take action. 3, I would say we need young people to be incorporated through every facet. Currently, our government does not look at young people as a way forward, and that we are radical and that we are a generation that needs to just, realize that this isn't going to change. But they were that same generation who fought and were radical, the same generation that saw the need for system change. And we would hope that they see that we are not just shouting for change because we want change, but rather because we understand what's at stake as much as they did back in the day when they were fighting. We have heard the call for change as they have heard the call for change, and we would hope that change would come. And lastly, a rising tide lifts all boats, but there's no boats for everyone, We need people to realize that as we move through this just transition or any form of transition through land, electricity, knowledge, that not everyone is capacitated to rise as the tides rise with us.
Sorry, Gabriel. We're running out of time.
That's my 4 points. Thank you.
So, Professor McKing, also, if you can just...
That's a great point to end off because you're right about the rising tide, Gabriel, and we're all facing that rising tide, but not everybody's in the same boat. Some people are on luxury yachts and some people are on sort of paddle makoros, and it's very much more difficult for the people in the canoes to deal with that rising tide. And just as a final point, I just want to say for all the adults, you really, really need to step up to the plate here and show the youth that you want to act in their best interest and that they can trust you in acting in their best interest, because that's where a lot of the mental trauma is coming from for children and youth, is that they feel that the adults are ignoring them, belittling them, patronizing them, and they cannot be trusted. So we, the adult generation, need to step up to the plate and say we are going to act in your best interest and we need to support your activism and be activists ourselves. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Onke. Gabriel, fantastic Thank you so much, and apologies for the sound problems.
Thank you so much, Professor Nick King, and thank you so much as well, Gabriel, for to both of you for joining us today and actually, further just stretching this conversation, and hopefully the audience as well has walked away with a bit of knowledge and better insight in terms of the effects of the climate crisis on future generations. Thank you all so much, and don't forget to sign up for the Our Burning Planet newsletter. Goodbye to you all.